Hello, and welcome to Ethically Speaking, a UCF interdisciplinary series on contemporary moral issues. My name is Steve Kubler, and I'm the organizer of this series, and I'm professor of chemistry and optics and founding associate director of the Center for Ethics at the University of Central Florida. And today we're going to hear from Dr. Joel MacClellan, who's an expert in bioethics, and he'll discuss the term euthanasia and how it's used in the context of animal-based research, but how that use may be clouding our judgment on what is really right and what is really wrong. Before we introduce Dr. MacClellan, I'll say a little bit about our speaker series and show you how you can participate. Let me just restart slides and share for a moment. Ethically Speaking is organized with my collaborator, Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who's professor of ethics and digital culture and founding director of the UCF Center for Ethics. And we developed Ethically Speaking to promote conversations about challenging issues of our time. And we encourage you to visit the center's website at ethicscenter.research.ucf.edu to learn more about our activities and to find out about other speakers in our series. I also want to encourage all who attend to please email me with your suggestions for future speakers and topics for Ethically Speaking. We're not running out of ideas, but I'd like to hear your ideas, and I think those could maybe be better. And we want to have topics that really interest you. So do please email me with your thoughts. Ethics, I hope you agree, connects to just every facet of our professional and personal lives. And the importance of ethics at UCF, I think, is clear from this long list of partners who support our series. And all of us hope you enjoy the discussions in Ethically Speaking. We hope it cultivates understanding of how ethics provides frameworks for making better decisions, particularly when they're competing values. Now, today's event is being recorded, and we'll post a link to the recording on the Center for Ethics website so you can view it again and share it with others. Throughout the talk, please submit your questions directly to Dr. Beaver, who will function as our moderator, and those are submitted to him via chat. And at the end of the presentation, Dr. Beaver will pose questions by theme to our speaker. So now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Jonathan Beaver, who will introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Professor Kubler. It's always great to be here with you all, and thanks for so many of you for coming back to Ethically Speaking. I'm really enjoying these conversations every time. So Professor Joel MacClellan is Assistant Professor of Philosophy and the Environmental Program Director at Loyola University of New Orleans. I'm really excited to host Dr. MacClellan this morning because he has a background, our backgrounds overlap. His background is in bioethics, sustainable development, ethics. Importantly for me, he was a scholar in residence at Wesleyan University supported by the Animals and Society Institute. And out of that work and his scholarship, he's published widely around questions of animals, environments, and ethics. As a professor, as a teacher, he teaches in areas of his expertise, including courses in medical ethics, environmental ethics, and ethical decision-making. He's also served importantly on his institution's Animal Care and Use Committee, or IACUC, as the federally mandated non-scientist representative on that committee. He and I have crossed paths several times at conferences and professional organizations, and I most recently heard him talk through ideas around this presentation last year at the Association of Practical and Professional Ethics. The sort of ethical tensions that Dr. MacClellan examines are central, both in questions of research ethics, maybe his emphasis here, but also in the broader context of how to live good lives in a complicated world. So I'm really pleased to host Dr. MacClellan, and I'll turn things over to him.
Great. Well, thank you for the generous introductions, Dr. Beaver. That was great. So yeah, today I'm gonna give a talk about what I'm calling the euthanasia euphemism on the deceptive use of euthanasia in animal research protocols. Yeah, I'm probably an expert in bioethics broadly construed, but the last couple of years I've mostly been working in environmental ethics, and I've never really published anything in research ethics, but I do have some background. I did a medical ethics clinical ethics practicum. I authored the responsible conduct of research training that was taken by University of Tennessee graduate students. And yeah, most recently on the IRB and the IACUC. And it's worth pointing out that it's through my involvement in the IACUC that this project happens. This is the first time in memory, at least, where my service has driven research. Okay, so I'll just jump right in. So two anecdotes to kind of connect me personally with this. And I don't believe in juju in the universe kind of a thing, but these are just sort of interesting recent things that have happened. So after I started this project, both of my two 16-year-old dogs, going back to graduate school, my partner and I had to make the decision to euthanize him about a year ago. So that's just personally connected with that. And then this was just sort of a more odd story. We were doing some camping up in DeSoto State Park in Alabama. Just nice week there. And then on the way out, we were following a trailer truck of broiler chickens, and we were actually stopped because they were doing some clear cutting there. So the road was down to one lane. One of the chickens from the top right corner jumped out of that and face planted into the asphalt and was clearly in its death throes in the ditch on the side. So I went to the car behind me and asked the lady, I was like, this creature's clearly going to die. Do you think I should put it out of its misery? And she said, oh yeah, you'd be doing it a kindness. So I've personally euthanized an animal within the last year, something I wasn't exactly expecting. So yeah, I'm pretty sensitive to animal ethical concerns, but by no means am I opposed to animal euthanasia. In fact, I've consented to it and personally performed it in recent memory. Okay, on to the talk proper. So first, the hook. So for those of us born in the prior millennium, there's a mid 1950s book and film by the name of Old Yeller. The short story of that is it's a beloved family pet that gets rabies and has to be put down behind the woodshed. So just imagine the following, right? So Old Yeller is euthanized. I think it's fair to say because posed a threat to others, but especially because is in Old Yeller's interest. It's a terminal prognosis, seems to be pretty painful. So now I think we understand that that's euthanasia. If anything's euthanasia, that's euthanasia. But now imagine Bessie. Imagine that Bessie on the same farm is also killed in the exact same manner. In other words, the method is exactly the same, and the amount of suffering, if any, endured through that killing is the same. Is that euthanasia? I think most people would say it's not, because the reason for the killing wasn't motivated by concern for the animal. It was because we wanted to eat it, use its leather, and so on. So if you get that distinction, that's pretty much like the gist of the talk. But now to put it a little bit more formally. So what I'm going to argue is that almost all animal euthanasia, at least in research, isn't. It's called euthanasia, but it's not, and this is a problem. So I'll talk about the Animal Welfare Act. So that has the most problematic definition, and that's the one that sort of has been really influential in a lot of subsequent guidelines for IACUCs and amongst other things. Interestingly, the AVMA now has a different definition. So they disagree with the Animal Welfare Act, but nonetheless, their position is incoherent, I'll argue, because they get the concept right, but then they sort of fall short in the application. So if that's right so far, that means that our government, the sciences, both within and outside of academia, and also professional organizations, systematically are representing about 100 million animal deaths. It's hard to determine actually the number of animals used in research because some happen in private facilities that aren't monitored. So it's suffice to say a rather large number. So
Bowen,
I think,
can you reshare your slides? We can't see those right now.
oh, you can't see those right now? My
Nope.
bad.
That's all right.
There we go. That looks like a more familiar Zoom screen. Sorry about that. All right. So
Perfect.
there's the anecdotes. I should at least show you all my two dogs, I and Bella, and then the broiler chicken truck. Okay. And then there's Old Yeller and Bessie. Now we're good. Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, I think I'll just skip that and move on. So just a couple of caveats of what I won't be talking about. I'm not going to be talking about the ethical treatment of animals in general, nor the ethics of euthanasia in general, nor the ethics of euthanasia and animal research in general. Those are all really big and interesting topics. I'm mostly concerned about the language and representation of this research. So I guess it's sort of like it's more about transparency and keeping good faith with the public and that kind of thing. Okay, so here I'm just going to go through some textbooky definitions of euthanasia to sort of suggest where I'm going. So this is from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. This is the literal dictionary definition of euthanasia. It's the act or practice of killing or permitting the death of hopelessly sick or injured individuals, such as persons or domesticated animals, in a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. Let me say that last part one more time. In a relatively painless way for reasons of mercy. Those two conditions are going to become really important. Some other good parts about this definition: it allows for both killing and so active and passive euthanasia, familiar with the term, discontinuing life support, that kind of thing. And also it references injured individuals. And so it's talking about specifically persons or domesticated animals. A lot of the next definitions you'll see only define euthanasia in terms of human killing, but clearly euthanasia is much broader than that. So I think despite philosophers using other definitions, the dictionary gets better than some philosophers have. So here's some just to give you a sense that I'm not like cherry picking. Here's a bunch of different sources of similar definitions of euthanasia, just to show you like this is what the word means. The Center for Health Ethics at the University of Missouri says the practice of ending the life of a patient to limit the patient's suffering. So it's pretty clearly about a mercy killing. And then Brad Hooker, in a famous piece, Rule Utilitarianism and Euthanasia, says euthanasia is either killing or passing up opportunities to save someone out of concern for that person. And then lastly, Robert Young in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he says, quote, when a person performs an act of euthanasia, she brings about the death of another person because, note the causal connection, because she believes. In other words, the act is motivated by the belief that the latter's existence is so bad that he would be better off dead, or believes that unless she intervenes and ends the life, his life will very soon become so bad that he would be better off dead. So these all have a sort of very common core, which I will distill as follows. They involve humane reason. So why are you killing a being? This is the part that's going to be really importantly missing in what's to come. Why are you killing the being? To end their suffering, to put them out of their misery, better off dead. I'm not going to be too concerned with the specifics of the humane reason, just that it's motivated by humaneness. And then secondly, a humane method. The manner in which they're killed is painless. So you take the least painful means available at the time. That probably modifies as we get better drugs and such. The advent of opioids are pretty important in all of this. And I argue that these are individually necessary and jointly sufficient. If you have a humane reason, but torture an animal to death, that's not euthanasia. If you kill an animal painlessly, but do so because you want to eat it or something, that's not a humane reason because it has nothing to do with the physical condition, the health or prospects of the animal. Okay, so the problem is that all animal research subjects are routinely killed at the end of the study. So that includes placebo control groups. In other words, lab-bred mice or rats, for example, that literally nothing has happened to them, and then the study's over. So, okay, they're just basically discarded after being killed. There are standard of care control groups. In other words, something will happen to them, and then we use the standard of care to compare how the experimental intervention compares. Is it as efficacious? How do the side effects compare? All that sort of thing. And then also experimental groups that are not experiencing pain and distress post-experiment. So sometimes like they got better, or it was a behavioral study. There wasn't any, they weren't mortally afflicted. So all those sorts of things. And that's a significant amount of research animals. And the sort of the big issue here is that, well, why are they being killed? Well, they're killed for our benefit, not for their benefit. They're killed not because they're suffering, not because they're about to suffer. We don't have a use for them anymore. Usually it's something like lack of resources or a claimed lack of resources, not mercy that's the motivation. Okay, so that's the sort of what I'll call the problem. Now let's move on to some real world definitions from the animal research context. So the Animal Welfare Act of 1966 says euthanasia means the humane destruction of an animal accomplished by a method that produces rapid unconsciousness and subsequent death without evidence of pain or distress, or a method that utilizes anesthesia produced by an agent that causes painless loss of consciousness and subsequent death. So often they do that two-step thing: first render unconscious, then kill. This is the definition that's important to IACUCs and animal research, because this is the law that impacts at least most of that research. And I'll just leave the biologist anonymous, but suffice to say it's someone at my institution, because we got back and forth about the fact, like, yeah, intent doesn't matter. And she said very clearly, this definition does not specify that the reason for euthanasia be compassionate, only the method. So spoiler, we've got the divergence there: humane method, but not humane reason. For those that are a little more familiar with the animal research context, there's this so-called the guide. So the guide is basically bureaucratic regulatory implementation of both the Animal Welfare Act, but also some further stipulations that the National Institutes of Health put on, because, for example, mice and rats are not covered by the Animal Welfare Act, yet those are more than 90% of research subjects. So the guide is sort of an augmentation and implementation of what the Animal Welfare Act says, and it applies to all research that's funded by the federal government in some form or fashion. Okay, so here's a sample animal use protocol from my institution. So here's note two parts to the euthanasia definition I'm about to read. At research endpoints, rats will be euthanized according to AVMA guidelines, blah, blah, blah. So they're the humane method, right? But then additionally, any rat that shows signs of pain, distress, and or deteriorating body condition will be removed from the study, assessed by the on-call vet, and euthanized at the vet's recommendation. So based on what I've said so far, the second part of this would be euthanasia because it's based in distress and such, pain, distress, and deteriorating body condition. That's euthanasia, but killing all of the other rats, just as a matter of course, at the research endpoint is not. But this is all smuggled together in a very small section on euthanasia, and all of this is covered as euthanasia. And interestingly, that study also allowed for students that were doing researchers along with the PI that they could opt out pairs of healthy rats as pets. There were some stipulations, like they had to go through some education and things like that. But it would be pretty curious if an animal was both in a condition that it ought to be euthanized and also a suitable candidate for adoption. So pretty clearly, we're talking about animals that are perfectly fine that would otherwise be killed, but are healthy enough to become pets. So, but also note there's some tension emerging here about, do we really want to be killing all these animals? So already there's some signs here that something might be amiss. Okay, so here's a reductio ad absurdum. For those that aren't philosophers, this is like how we reduce that definition to absurdity by following out some implications. Consider the following. If humane reason doesn't matter, only humane method. Cattle are euthanized in slaughterhouses. Snipers euthanize with headshots. Hunters euthanize their prey by killing them. The guillotine was used to euthanize political opponents during the French Revolution. And if I do a home invasion after asphyxiating folks with carbon dioxide so they're unconscious, and then I decapitate and rob them, I euthanize them. None of this makes sense, right? But those follow straightforwardly from that definition. Okay, don't worry, I'm not going to have you read this wall of text. I just want folks to have the big reference here. I'm going to be talking about this and this part down here. Feel free to follow through. This is widely available by the AVMA, but suffice to say, this is the professional organization of vets akin to the American Medical Association that folks might be more familiar with in the DM rather than DVM context, or sorry, MD rather than DVM. But yeah, so here's what their original definition from 2007. So this is exactly consistent with the Animal Welfare Act. They defined in their 2007 white paper on animal euthanasia that, quote, euthanasia is the act of inducing humane death in an animal. So humane death, it's only about the method, not about the reason. So they used to have a consistent definition, but interestingly, they changed that just 5 years later, and it's elaborated on more fully in the more recent 2020 version. This is all a quote from that page I just showed a second ago. They say the veterinarian's prima facie duty in carrying out euthanasia includes, but is not limited to, their humane disposition to induce death in a manner that is in accord with an animal's interests and or because it's a matter of welfare. So that means specifically, secondly, the use of humane techniques to induce the most rapid and painless and distress-free death possible. So humane disposition, humane techniques, the two conditions that I've argued are essential for it. And I think this is really interesting. They say these conditions, while separate, are not mutually exclusive and are codependent. I think there's real wisdom in that you have to have the interest of the being in mind if you care about bringing about via a method. Those are sort of attuned to one another. I think that's really insightful. So vets are not the bad guys here. I just want to kind of make that clear. But then just after this definition, they're sort of they say the following. So despite that really clear and I think correct definition for what euthanasia is, they go on to sort of, okay, now let's look at like what this means in context. They say debate exists about whether euthanasia appropriately describes the killing of some animals at the end of biological experiments and of unwanted shelter animals. The panel believes that evaluating the social acceptability of various uses of animals and or the rationale for inducing death in these cases is beyond its purview. However, AVMA policy supports the use of animals for various purposes and recognizes the need to euthanize animals that are unwanted or unfit for adoption. So they just said humane reason had to be there or it's not euthanasia, but now they're saying you can euthanize animals that we don't want. That's incoherent. But also notice some punting, right? They're saying deaths outside of the veterinary animal deaths outside the veterinary context are beyond their purview. And I think it's important to note that that's going to mean a lot of deaths in the research context. They're basically saying like there's deaths that veterinarians cause, and there's deaths that say animal researchers cause, which may not be veterinarians. So they're basically saying I think they're signaling that there's a change in their posture relative to what it used to be, probably showing some what I'd call moral progress, but that's not universal and is certainly, I think, behind in the animal research community. Okay, so what's happening here? I think what's happening here is, well, first off, I'll just shout out for philosophy. There may be a little bit of lack of critical thinking here and just lack of conceptual clarity. And maybe it's something more nuanced like this as well, that veterinarians and animal researchers, they basically say, like, we have to do animal research. That's part of our job description. And given that, we need to kill animals that aren't wanted. So then they have to treat these killings as permissible or obligatory. So in other words, the thought something like this. This is under our purview. That's our role. We'll do so painlessly. That seems like a good kind of killing. Euthanasia is a good kind of killing. So this must be also euthanasia, but there's some slippage there. And then, yeah, ultimately, I think this is a euphemism both to the public because it misrepresents a very contentious and morally vexing issue as something other than it is, something rosier than it is. And also, it may serve to hide what's really going on to researchers themselves. I guess in the interest of time, I won't walk you through Sartrean bad faith, but I think it's actually a really good example for the philosophers in the room. And I'll just give like one more practical example. Animal researchers that I know, they refer to the killing of animals at the end of research endpoints. They call it sacking, sacrificing, which is an especially interesting, often sort of religiously laden term. But so there seems to be discomfort on their end in calling a spade, I guess. And it's sort of in their benefit psychologically to think of what's going on as it being maybe different or better than it in fact is. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to consider a couple of objections to this now, and then I'll hopefully wrap up with enough time for Q&A. So first objection, something like this. It's permissible to use stipulative definitions. So it's permissible to define euthanasia as painless killing, regardless of intent. Or you might insert something else here. It's permissible to have a different definition of animals than it is for humans or something like that. And as a philosopher, I'm very familiar with stipulative definitions. We use them all the time, but I think it's important when it's in a sort of a academic context where it's for a fairly narrow audience, where we're, investigating some concept where it doesn't have, real world impacts. Here we're talking about important regulatory, well, first off, the Animal Welfare Act. We're talking about U.S. law, but we're also talking about important regulatory compliance issues. So I think it's important to be transparent in what's actually going on. So I think we need to actually stick to generally recognized language. And if anything's clear, the 2,000 years of history of the word euthanasia suggests that it hasn't changed ever really at all. And this spurious stipulative definition is very likely to mislead the average person when they hear about this sort of thing. Like, oh, they euthanize all animal research or animals in research. Great. That's great that they do that for them. But they might have something else in mind than what's really going on. A second objection is to infirm the humane reason but deny the application. So the thought here is something like this, that at the end of a research protocol, what do we have here? We have often specially bred strains that are of domesticated rats. If we do nothing, the alternative is what? They'll starve to death or cannibalize each other in captivity or something like that. So in other words, their relevant alternatives are worse. In other words, given their current situation, it's better for them to be dead than it is to continue life as such. But notice here that there's been a little bit of a bait and switch, because the reason here isn't the underlying physical condition of the animal. They're perfectly healthy. These are environmental considerations, specifically artificially constrained alternatives. In other words, there are alternatives other than keeping them in a cage and not doing anything and euthanizing them. So I deny that humane reason would cover this, because it's not ultimately concern for the animal that's motivating it. If it were, we'd be doing something else. Okay, now here's the most complex and I think interesting objection. This is from some German researchers this is, of course, a very sensitive issue for them because of the Holocaust and final solution, which was called euthanasia internally. And the word has been illegal for use there. So that's sort of been something that's vexing. And they argue that we need to sort of reclaim the good old word is the name of the piece. And they say, so I'll read all of this, pardon the long text, and I'll give a couple of further examples they give to give you a little bit of sense of what they're talking about. So they say, why should not the act we perform at the end of an animal experiment be termed euthanasia? This is simply because one cannot, for example, induce experimental sepsis in an animal, cut its abdomen, and very probably infect it mortally, and then, when the experiment is finished, kill the animal and claim to be performing euthanasia simply because a reasonable life would no longer be possible for the animal. This sounds strange. Indeed, the isolating act of terminating the life of an animal which cannot continue normal, valuable life after the experiment, according to the definition given above. Spoiler, they give the same definition that I do. It has the two parts. So in other words, what they're saying is, it sounds like this sort of case conforms with the definition of euthanasia, but then they go on. However, to decide what kind of an act this is, the entire procedure must be seen as a whole. Indeed, to decide whether a fragment of an act is euthanasia or not, the entire act and the intentions behind the act must be taken into account. So basically what they're saying, we can't look at the killing only, we have to look at the broader context, not the context of the action. The whole action is a bigger thing than this action slice that happens at the end. This just is kind of an unusual way of talking to me, but they give a couple of other examples I think are kind of interesting that animate where they're coming from. They give an example of someone in the context of a battle on the battlefield, there's an executioner going around who's, pardon, some of this can be very, upsetting, but this matters, where they're just shooting enemy combatants. And then, so when they try to shoot them the first time, that's an execution. But suppose that it's a non-lethal blow, they shoot them again. Now, they would have died anyways. That second shot, is that euthanasia or not? They want to say, no, that's not euthanasia. They also consider the case of capital punishment. So you deliver a lethal injection. I'm from Ohio. I know very well we have a lot of failed lethal injections because we're using chemical concoctions that aren't really fit for that purpose. But suffice to say, we've botched some executions. So if the person then comes back and gives a second dose or a different dose where the person's already effectively dying because of the poisons from the first dose, the worry is that second dose would be euthanasia. But they say that can't be right either. And then they also give the example of Nazi concentration camps. So if you put someone in a condition artificially such that they're starving and maimed or worse, and then enact the final solution, that can't be called euthanasia because of the broader context. I think they're onto something here, but I think ultimately they're wrong. But I think this is maybe the most interesting objection. So I have a slide dedicated just to it. First, there's a bit of a regress problem. When does my action start? For an animal researcher, does it start with their training in graduate school? Does it start the day they were born? Is it in their parents' gene? No, it seems hard to, if we're amplifying the name euthanasia to include all of the Holocaust, it sounds like we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. I think the more powerful objection is that I think what's really going on, they kind of recognize this before that however transition, is that only the humane method condition is realized and the humane reason condition is not. or at least I think there's a lot of suspicion about the actors in these cases. So I think the issue is really this, is determining intent on an internal basis versus external basis. So if you have the same person, the executioner, it's really hard for us to tell, and it's really hard for sort of regulatory issues to be able to determine what someone's intent is if they were a moment ago an executioner and now a euthanizer. So I think what's really going on is something like that, but we want some kind of better verification that what the motive really is. And I think also they might be sort of conflating the wrongness of an entire complex of actions with what's right to do at a particular point in time, even given that broader context. So I think I'll just say, I think it was true that so if you're given a lethal ejection and you're in terrible straits and are going to die anyways, finishing that is humane. That seems just pretty plausible to me, but I have doubts of whether the executioner actually manifests that attitude given what their job is. So this kind of mirrors the treatment research distinction, I believe, put first in the Belmont report, or at least put early in the Belmont report, which has kind of associated role responsibilities. So if you think within the animal research context, it's very similar. It's more complicated maybe in the human research context, but I'll just stick with animals. So what's the goal of researchers is to produce knowledge. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to produce novel knowledge through using animal studies. Not and that could be consistent with humane, but isn't motivated as an end to be humane. Whereas the veterinarian, their role is medical care. And if you remember back to the slide I gave of a sample animal use protocol for my institution, note that the first group of killings, the placebo, those were killed by the researchers. But if there was acute distress, what I'm calling actual euthanasia, they bring in the veterinarian. So that shift is not just a shift of roles, it's a shift of people with very different mandates. So I think that manifests the external constraint of like, oh yeah, we know what their real motive is here. Just to be clear, I do think use and respect are compatible on these sorts of issues. So I disagree with Tom Regan, for example. So I do think researchers could switch gears mentally, but I think there are some reasons to keep this separate when we can. And also compare in the example of the executioner on the battlefield. I mean, for me, if someone's dying on the battlefield and the only alternative is them suffering and starving to death or something like that, and if you kill them, then that's to me a very paradigmatic example of euthanasia. If that's not euthanasia, I'm not clear what is. But I think the issue there was that it was the executioner that was also the possible euthanizer. And it's pretty clear that if it's a soldier, what they're trying to do is kill or disable the enemy. But the field medic, they're trying to administer a lethal dose of morphine to put them out of their misery. Now, maybe that could be the same person. I think that's where our concerns arise. So I'm not convinced that we should say that effectively no killing in a research context could ever be euthanasia. That seems to me to just be dead wrong. But that's something I want to sort of hear y'all's thoughts about, especially. So on to sort of some more positive stuff. What should we do about this if I'm right? To the left here is a monument to the laboratory mouse. This is in Siberia, in Russia. I don't know. I just think this is kind of cool. Now, it's only symbolic, but symbolism is maybe better than what we're doing right now. So I think at minimum, truth in advertising. Don't call it euthanizing when it's not. Don't call it sacking, an abbreviated word for maybe half-truth seems even worse. And I'll just point out elsewhere in the same document where the AVMA talks about euthanasia after the definition and discussing the laboratory context, they talk about the humane slaughter of livestock. They don't call that euthanasia. They call that humane slaughter. So I'm not sure if that's the preferred term, but I'll just point out that it's already in currency, and that's at least a more apt, I think, way of describing it. But euthanize, put down, all these kinds of things are a little too euphemistic. And I'll just point out there are alternatives to animal research. Roland and Brunch's 3Rs. Replace animal research where possible. Reduce the number of animals that are used. And, geez, what's the third one? Something about reducing the burden. I forget the third R, but yeah, making it less painful and that sort of thing. And let's see. Also, I think there's probably some reason to have institutional reform in animal research. So we saw this in the medical field in the 1960s and 70s. That's frankly what gave rise to the field of bioethics. But there's a lot more connection between the public and what the professionals are doing. So trust me, it wasn't exactly the medical professionals that were pushing for these changes. It was because of legal and ethical challenges. So there has been some really good reform, but I think that's because of public involvement. But animal research is definitely behind closed doors for the most part in a way that is in some respects intentional because of affronts by the animal rights community and that sort of thing. So they just don't want to talk about this. And I have some personal anecdotes. If I had more time, I'd give you there. But I think there's sort of some shadows of behaviorism operating here, or just maybe sort of legacy views in terms of like the training. So grad school is a lot of things, but it may also be partly a kind of inculcation in a certain ideology about how we're supposed to think and talk about this. And I'll just sort of say, because this has become public at my university, I got a research fellowship and for just this issue. And I kind of, it's sort of a public call out, like, hey, I think our IACUC's doing things wrong. Here's how I think it could do better. Behind the scenes, a lot of researchers have said, like, oh yeah, this is super contentious of how to describe this. And some journals won't allow you to describe this as euthanasia. Some require it. So it's just super hotly contested. But because there maybe isn't that philosophical background with the strength in critical thinking, it's not really, this hasn't been resolved. So they're isolated from public opinion. Also, I think IACUCs are structurally designed for animal research to happen. So Dr. Beaver had mentioned that I'm the mandated non-scientist institutional member. So there actually have to be at least 3 effectively animal researchers that are on it, and the internal non-scientist, that's me, and a person that's external to the institution all the way. But most stuff proceeds by majority vote. What's 3/5 majority vote? And then I'll just point out in our own case, the outside party is actually a former student of one of these researchers. So there's a bit of worry that a lot of this stuff is just sort of meant to railroad these things through. Just to be clear, my own experience with our IACUC has actually, for the most part, been really positive. I've been working with people that are very sensitive and much better informed on the empirical side about what matters for animal welfare, both in terms of the methodology and also the research endpoints. So I defer to scientists there, and it's really great. They do care. I just want to point that out. But that's not sort of a structural requirement of IACUCs. And also, they tend to be heavily compliance focused. There's a lot of money on the line. Will the institution lose their funding? Will people lose their jobs if they're out of compliance? So if you all have any familiarity with IRBs, at least in my own experience, our Loyola University, we have a prison education program. So it's really progressive. We grant bachelor's degrees for free to people in the state penitentiary, which is kind of awesome. But we wanted to do, not me, but some folks in my institution wanted to do some statistical research, just questionnaires. They're not doing medical research on prisoners, just to be clear. But we had a pretty nuanced conversation, a real ethics conversation about whether you can actually have consent in that context, the whole notion of prisons being total institutions, whether consent is possible. In other words, we were dealing with, substantive moral issues, not just like, what does the law say? And then maybe also hospital ethics committees. I've had some involvement with them. Legal matters matter. There's a lawyer present and all of that, but they're pretty open to discussing the ethics because it's not clear from the laws and medical practice alone what ought to be done in all cases. And then maybe just the last point, seems like we ought to consider more adoption at research endpoints, not for, anthrax-infected mice or something like that, but something along the lines of no-kill shelters. Because think about what we do with respect to other animals that serve social goods. Think about service animals, military military animals, canine units. We don't kill them when we're done with them. We sort of honor them in important ways. It strikes me as deeply divergent how we deal with mice and rats in the research context. We kill them and throw them away. And just as a sense of the public being in some ways ahead of the research community on this, here's just one example. This is from Michigan from relatively recently, 2023. This did not pass last I checked, but there was a proposed law, and I should point out it was limited for cats and dogs. But and the law that the bill was uh, pitching not just for the permissibility of adoption of animals that would be appropriate, but it was required. It was the default. In other words, they could not be killed. And the motivating reason is concern for cats and dogs. Now, maybe that's, from my point of view, kind of speciesist and selective, the creatures that we happen to live with and care a lot about and that kind of thing. But mice and rats are also mammals, pretty cognitively similar. Yes, they have shorter lives, but I'm not sure that matters from a point of view there. And then where am I going from here? I'll just point out another personal tie just to end on that note. A friend of mine and in some ways colleague during graduate school at the University of Tennessee, he was down in their vet program, Paul Nolan. He went into the small animal field. And his first job out of grad school once he graduated was to be a tech. And he took his own life using meds acquired in the lab. It's just really tragic. He was a great guy, but I think a big part of it was the moral costs of his job. If you look up the highest suicide rates and attrition rates, doctors and nurses and vets are at the top of the list. So I've mostly talked about animals here. I'm now interested a little more in the ethics with respect to the side of the killer. So some euthanasia is about a peaceful death, but it's sort of like peace, or like also if there's a lot of blood and it looks gory, that seems to feel bad on the human side, but it might not matter from the point of view of the animal. But should this matter? Do we want like kill them quietly in boxes so that it doesn't, impact us psychologically? So should euthanasia be easy on euthanizers? And also because we're in the age of growing AI and automated systems, and just 2 days ago, the Anthropic AI now removed the ethical constraints that now allows autonomous killing of human beings by robots. So this is the world we now live in. Would it be a good idea to have automated euthanasia to reduce the moral cost on researchers? I'm not sure about that, and I'm kind of a mixed mind. All right, that's what I've got. That seems to have been about time. Thanks so much for listening, and I look forward to y'all's comments and questions.
Joel, thank you so much. That was great. We've got plenty of time for questions. I've got several of my own. So I think, folks, if you all have questions for Dr. MacClellan, please, you can send them to me in the chat. I'm happy if you, since we're a relatively small group, just want to unmute and ask a question or raise your hand in Zoom here. I'm welcome that too. But Dr. MacClellan, as you were talking, I sort of ended up with 4 buckets of questions.
Okay.
I'm going to give you those buckets and then you can pick and choose, but I think I know where I want to start. So one bucket is moral theory. I've got just a question for you on the theoretical side. One is practical about ayacooks and their function. The third is empirical. I've got a couple of questions about like just what do we know and how do we know it. And then the last bucket is just stuff that I want more on and I think that's where I'd want to start. You mentioned you had some personal anecdotes about ayacook's experience. I'd love to hear more about how your ayacook functions. I think I've been sort of frustrated here that our ayacook has told me explicitly they do not want and do not need and do not have an external non-scientist expert on their committee. So I think I just want to know a little bit more about how things work from your perspective. So any
Well, let me give a juicier one than ayacook. This goes back to grad school. So I mentioned very
Okay.
briefly that I co-authored a responsible conduct of research training program. So it's like this was, around 2010 or so. So, but the gist of it was for any graduate student or faculty person that was receiving federal dollars for their research, they were required by the institution, by the University of Tennessee, to go through this online training program. And it was very broad. It was about, misrepresenting research, stuff about plagiarism, but also there were modules on research involving human subjects and research involving animal subjects. So Dr. Glenn Graber, if anybody knows that, old hat medical ethicist, he's retired now, but still active in his nursing home. I visited him recently. He's a badass. But so I was the sole author of the theoretical models we co-authored, but then we split it up for there. And I was the sole author of the responsible conduct using animal research subjects. And just to be clear, this is basically a slide deck that I thought was sort of mainstream vanilla. This is why there's so much controversy. Here are some of like the lines of philosophical thought, much broader than the animal rights literature. Um, but it included that just to give folks a sense of like, why is this so controversial? Um, and all of the rest of these modules went through, but here's the big but. Once we had to circulate these drafts to the respective units that this would be impacted by. So I sent this unit to the veterinary school, and they wanted a meeting. And in retrospect, Dr. Graber was like, I should have been there with you, but they practically took me behind the woodshed. They did. I thought they were going to want reforms. This never got published. This just got completely shut down. They were very emotional, very upset, just actively hostile to the very idea of talking about these issues. And that was a pretty formative experience for me in grad school that like, wow, these are like otherwise sort of, even-keeled professionals. This was not professional. So that didn't directly answer your question, but it really kind of poisoned the well for me in a way that I've tried to kind of recover from, that not everybody's like that. And I'll just point out that the people were, older generations, let's just put it that way, and newer generations might have a little bit of different perspective as there's been changing public attitudes on that sort of thing. But my work with the IACUC, yeah, it's been sort of interesting. We only need a few people to get a quorum. So I'm kind of the sideshow, the weird philosopher. So I do really feel like an outsider. And I was like, do I really want to, do I even do I make a deal about this at all? And so do I make a big deal about it? And I haven't really in the context of our meetings, but I thought I should do so sort of in publications. But I did bring up, like, I think we're using euthanasia wrong. We keep doing it. And then I developed a sort of, the Marquette Fellowship is university-wide competition. So it's kind of a big known thing that's my view on that. And it's kind of, I don't think it's going to change. But there hasn't been any internal, like we don't talk about euthanasia differently inside the IACUC, but that has to do more with the prerogatives of the chair, who of course is a researcher. And I kind of wonder, like along the lines of what you said, should I still be there? Am I more helpful inside than not being involved at all? Given that they're not hostile, like, it's a small institution. We know each other and work well together. But yeah, what's the point of me being there? I sometimes wonder. But my sort of practical view is I tend to sort of be more of a Bernard Rollins type, internal reform, make the world better where you can, not just pray for the big abolitionist thing. So I'm not even sure that's the right view anyways, but that's probably too long of an answer. But that's some of where I'm coming from with my practical interactions with vets and animal researchers.
No, that's great. I sort of grew up philosophically on the Bernie Rollins line of
Okay. I
thinking,
saw
and I
you
think,
smile. Yeah.
yeah. Yes, yeah. I miss him dearly. I was going to ask you, you answered one of my questions about whether you brought this argument up in your own IACUC. And my other question about IACUC specifically was, what's the role of the veterinarian who's also required to be on the committee? Um, do they, do you not see veterinarians like advancing contemporary AVMA guidance on IACUCs, or are they more just there for the medical advice in the moment?
I suspect that's highly variable because there always has to be a vet. So I should point out there's the three internal people, plus a couple of others, the outside person. Loyola is a very small liberal arts school. We're not an R1. We don't have a vet school.
Yeah.
It's actually, we have a Tulane vet that is on our IACUC. And also point out, like, frankly, we're not required to have an IACUC for certain purposes because we don't research on those animals, but we just do it sort of to make sure we're especially above board. So I think that itself speaks to it. But the way that our vet's role is in this is, I think, just not trying to rock the boat. They're sort of in an advisory capacity, but I suspect that varies widely, and probably there's more involvement where the person is involved in the institution and is one of all could also potentially be a researcher. So I think there's probably a lot of variability there. But I think maybe underlying your question is the training and goals of animal researchers are quite a bit different, I think, than the training and goals of vets. And I think that that wearing two hats problem probably does weigh heavier on them. And I think they, in some sense, are serving two masters here. They have to serve, or more than two, animal researchers, agricultural communities, uh, pet owners, and and I think that that's kind of the public view from the pet stuff and changing public perceptions of animals is more directly related to their practice than it is with animal research, which happens behind closed doors. So I think they're a better inroad probably than philosophers ever will be, frankly. And I bet
That makes good sense.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I've got a lot more questions for you from me, but I've got two from folks in the audience here. So David Goldstein asked, how does kosher ritual slaughter fit into your model of euthanasia? Just as an
Um,
example, one you didn't talk through.
yeah, so well, I'll just say like kosher and halal, those are pretty similar practically, like a slitting of the throat. So I just put it this way, are those were humane given the tools available at the time that those laws, those dietary laws internal to those religions were put into place. So I think they involved state-of-the-art humane method at the time. I think it's pretty quick, the death there, but given tools more recently available, I'm not so sure that ritual slaughter would pass the humane method condition anymore, given current alternatives. I know there are concerns because you don't want to dope up something you're about to eat with morphine and things like that, but stunning before killing, I know that's prohibited, if I'm not mistaken, by kosher law. That seems hard to accept from a point of view of acting in the best interest of the animal. It sounds like we're acting in the interest of continuing a tradition, not modifying it in light of new things. And I will point out just the whole ritualism of slaughter. Like this is just wild to me. But back in the ancient Greek world, they're just very bizarre historical anecdotes of it would be like the equivalent of their priests that would do the killing, but then they would like blame the knife and hold a trial. There's a very important psychological distancing that we sort of socially try to do of like what exactly who is the killer here? It's not even it's society puts onto one person who puts it onto the object. Yeah, so it's just sort of
Sort of a priests don't kill people, knives kill people sort of model. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. David, go ahead, please. Feel free. I asked
Yeah,
a question for you, but go ahead.
I want to tell you just anecdotally, I worked in a kosher meatpacking plant on the kill floor, and I actually witnessed an animal, a cow being killed, ritually slaughtered. And I asked the USDA inspector there, uh, is this the most humane way that the animal is killed? And I haven't, he said that I haven't seen a more humane way than the kosher kill method. So, in other words, when you mentioned that in ancient times it was the most humane way, but you weren't sure if it was the most humane way today. And according to that, my personal experience, the USDA inspector said there's not a more humane way. It's as humane as the other way they were killing the cows, which at my plant was they would put an air gun and just and bolt the brain and kill the animal. But
No,
sometimes
that immediately renders them unconscious. Then their throat is slit. So there's one
no,
step.
no,
No.
never. It
Okay.
has to be the slowest. The throat is slit first, and then the bolt. But when it's not kosher, because the plant did not kosher, non-kosher kill as well, they just did the bolt. But the animal, sometimes they missed. They would try to get it in the right position, but if they missed, the animal would suffer. And if when they slit the throat, if the animal suffered, then it wasn't kosher. It would go to the non-kosher designation. So my understanding from just this is very anecdotal because it's just me witnessing this was that kosher kill, if done properly, is that there's not a more humane way. The animal, now the person doing the shochet, the person doing it says the animal does feel, but it's like a paper cut. It's not like the animal is suffering. But the way I saw it was the animal, they slit the throat, then the blood comes gushing out, and then they did the gun on top of the head, and then the animal, it was like the animal went, wow, and it was like the animal was just
Yeah.
dead. And then, then they had a chain, they lifted the animal upside down, put it on like an assembly line from the top of the ceiling. But it was dead. Now, also, uh, other parts that aren't related to humaneness were that if the animal didn't urinate when it was killed, it was also not kosher. So if the animal had some ailment, and then they also checked the liver, the lungs, the stomach. Sometimes they would find debris in the stomach, and they would say that's not kosher, but that's not really related to humaneness.
Okay, well, if
But
I could just
David,
jump in. So
thank you.
I'm pretty sure that having your throat slit is going to feel worse than having a paper cut, just as a point in fact. I'm no expert, but I'm just going
no,
from.
I'm talking about
Yeah.
the delay.
Yeah. Oh,
In
okay.
other words, when you do a paper cut, there's usually a delay before you feel it.
Hmm.
So it's a lot worse to get your throat cut, but the delay, that the thinking is that the animal feels it, but the delay, and then when it's dead.
Okay.
So
Well, I mean, I'll largely to defer to some of philosophers on the empirical side, but that's what you said is incongruent with my understanding of how cattle are typically killed in a slaughterhouse. I put a book recommendation in the chat, every 12 seconds by Timothy Patcherat. He's a political scientist who went undercover and worked in a slaughterhouse. So a big part of the captive bolt gun thing is the line speeds are really fast. They're not doing it slow enough to do it well. But now I may be wrong about this, but the whole point of doing that first is to render the animal unconscious, not to kill them. They're then lifted by the leg and then their throat slit. So it's just a question of whether they're conscious, whether their throat slit or not. And my understanding is, as a matter of fact, being rendered instantly unconscious is you therefore don't feel your throat being slit. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, and it certainly would be true if you got hit in the eye socket or something. But if it happens right at the point of the brain stem, that seems to be that stat.
yeah, and what I was told was they use the air gun, or the gun on top of the head afterwards, so that the animal, when they then go to process it, it's not jerking. So it was done for a practical reason after the coach. So in other words, the animal is dead, but I guess when you kill via the throat, it still could jerk more when you're trying to process it. The air gun, uh, hitting the brain, I guess stops the nerves. That's what I was told. This is
Okay.
all anecdotal, though. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
just one person working on
yeah,
a
not my
kosher.
area of expertise, but I have a different understanding there. Yeah.
Yeah, David, thanks for the question. I've got two more at least, and then
Okay.
Gretchen. So the first one came from Ian Biazzo, who's a colleague of ours, um, and is a biology professor. He had to step away. His questions, I'm just going to read it to you, Joel. He says, "Great talk. Do you have insights on the current practices for invasive animal species? While not confined to indoor lab research, these issues also often come up with field research. IACUC and government policies often demand invasive animals are killed, euthanized. Given your framework, the methods are often efficient, but the release from pain and suffering is not as clear. Would you argue that this should also not be considered euthanasia, or is the impact on other native species enough justification for this designation? For instance, the Burmese pythons in the Everglades."
Or nutria here is the big example in the
Yeah,
Louisiana swamps. Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's $10 a pelt if you turn them in, and many others besides. So I think I got the gist of the question. And this is something of great interest to me personally, because the role and value of individual animals within conservation context. I actually have a working paper on invasive species, like the ethics of invasive species management right now. And I'm not, abolitionist, never intervene or never kill. I think what I'd say is basically what I've said here is that's I won't touch the justificate. Like, is that a justified killing? Let's just say yes. Is it euthanasia? No. So that seems pretty straightforward to me. Why? Because the purpose is the good of other species or perhaps human economic interests or something like that. It's not the good of that entity, so it can't be euthanasia. But it nonetheless may well be justified. So we might want to call it humane slaughter or something like that. Culling is I mean, that's a biological word that he's probably familiar with. I mean, we generally know that culling isn't euthanasia. It may also be. Sometimes it's because of genetic anomalies and things like that. But yeah, uh, not using the euthanasia word sounds right to me.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Ivy asked a question in the chat about your suggestion or the possibility of robots possibly doing euthanasia.
Hmm.
She suggests that maybe who's doing the killing is still humans. And I guess the question might be like, does that affect the landscape of robots euthanizing?
That in response to the captive bolt gun thing, Ivy, or robots doing the killing? It was a little unclear to me. But
Yeah, Ivy, if you want to unmute and ask your
because
question,
I think that's right when she brought that up. Because
yeah.
I think I will point out that's why I actually put the every 12 seconds by Timothy Patchett thing in there, because even within the context of the slaughterhouse, everyone who works there doesn't think they're the bad guy. It's just the one who's the so-called knocker, the one with the captive bolt gun. That's the bad guy. And he probably says, it's not me, it's the gun, right? Because you kind of have to. That's an incredibly awful job. They need psych evals on the regular. But maybe to answer the broader question of automated killing, and again, just spitballing here because I haven't really worked these thoughts through. I think what we'd still need to have, like, however we code the AI, like what's its basis for judgment would be. So we'd have to have like the humane reason be in there, and I'm not going to attribute moral agency to AI, at least not yet, but act by proxy based on our values, but with the lack of the downside of the person who does it having to feel the distress of having to kill. I actually tend to think that the the friction there of humans being involved is probably really important, given how likely we are to abuse these kinds of things. But as a kind of consequentialist leaning philosopher, I can see some upsides to that as well. Oh,
Yeah.
here she
Oh yeah,
says,
gotcha.
yeah, you're right. Same concept. So this, we just want to, we're uncomfortable with it. We want to have someone else, someone other than us do it. So I think that kind of does embody that. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. Thanks for that thought. Gretchen's had a
Gretchen,
question. Okay.
Gretchen, I see your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. MacClellan. It's nice to meet you.
You too.
So I was wondering more about how to operate at the individual level when you're concerned about this. I have a few friends who are getting involved in animal research or veterinary care, and the enculturation process seemed pretty extreme from what I've seen. You know, like I've witnessed them have nearly no opinion on many topics to having very severe opinions on topics. And I feel that maybe like veterinary school is very specific and impassioned. And so you mentioned like your grad school experience where it became not professional when you brought up a touchy subject. So operating at the individual level, like, what would you recommend people do if even if it's a cognitive reframing in their own minds or connecting to other peers and other students as they're being enculturated?
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert in how to achieve social change. I'm just a lowly philosopher, but I think the idea is something like their isolation and insularity seems to be a big part of the cause of the problem. That they're just like an ostrich with their head in the sand. Like they know there's this big problem out there, but if they can just keep their heads in the lab and just not let the word get out, all is well. But that whole framing just seems to be cracking because there's enough generational change and increased understanding about the mental lives of non-human animals and other things that it's increasingly hard to hold the line, if you will. Um, so I'm not sure what the most effective steps are to get that to change. Probably it's better for folks internal than outside parties, but greater representativeness of outside perspectives might be worth. So maybe just as an anecdote here, when I teach medical ethics, I often give a couple of examples of like, hey, here's a potential animal study, and they're pretty radical, I think, and like they disapprove things that I wouldn't intuitively expect them to do. So I think that the public is not exactly at the same place as the animal research that the serving the and they're supposed to serve the public, but maybe they're not giving us what we want. So I think that's a problem too. And that's I'm not really sure how to fix. And I mean, our federal government isn't exactly that functional right now. The Animal Welfare Act is going on 75 years old. The last version of the guide is over a decade old. So, yeah, it's hard to see there being absent some serious structural changes in the federal government to see like progressive change on behalf of animals. There's been a lot of regulatory capture by researchers and pharmaceutical interests and that kind of thing.
That's a good answer. I think,
Okay.
the asterisk more research needed is always really important. So that'll be interesting, and I can't wait to share that with them. Thank
Wait, I
you.
didn't say more research needed, more talking needed. Yeah,
Well,
not
I think
research. Yeah.
behavioral
Okay.
research or
Yeah. Okay.
motivation research
Yeah.
could be
Okay.
really interesting and for this discipline. I think there could be some really great projects done on at the interpersonal level in this kind of education. So I think that could be really cool.
Yeah, like the psychology and sociology of social change, that kind of thing. Maybe I need to know more
Hmm.
about that stuff, but
Yeah, that'd be really interesting. Thank you.
thank you.
Dr. Kubler has a question for you that feels to me like Paul Thompson's blind chicken problem.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Kubler.
Okay, I think I don't know Paul Thompson, but I think I get the blind chicken reference. Dr. MacClellan, thanks for your talk. It was really got me thinking, quite provocative. And I was wondering about creation of new species, genetic variants or knockouts that limit the normal function of a species. And I don't have good examples. I know they make furless mice and whatnot, but I'm thinking there could be variants that are probably in use that make it difficult, if not impossible, for the normal life of the organism. And therefore some would say, and they have to be destroyed at the end of use or the end of the research. What does your research tell you? How does it inform you to think about ethical weightiness, if any, of creating those variants and the apparent necessity or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't even need to be that specific to like bespoke, genetically designed lab creatures. I mean, just think about domesticated dogs, like the inbreeding problem with. So that's a big controversy in that area because you're basically designing like bulldogs that can't breathe, German shepherds that are gonna have hip dysplasia pretty much no matter what you do. So the question, I guess, is more broad. Like, should we intentionally create creatures in a way that's opposed to their own good? I partly kind of want to punt and say I'm not sure that has to do much with the substance of this talk, but that seems to be kind of an important, bigger question to ask. Should we be doing this? But I think maybe to connect it with what I have said, it seems like there'd be stronger grounds to euthanize such research animals after the study because they're constitutionally designed such that their welfare isn't in mind. So, assuming that the overall research is justified, it would seem that those would be cases of euthanasia because it would be something internal to the health of the organism. I guess that's sort of an ambiguous case between external environmental considerations versus internal. So that's a really interesting one. But in the sort of ethics of vegetarianism literature, have you heard of like knockout animals, like headless chickens and that kind of thing? So there's kind of a big question in the ethical literature on this of do we change the environment wherein we raise these animals? Do we change where they live and how they're slaughtered? So in other words, do we change the environment that we create for them, or do we change how they are to better fit in that environment? I don't have a developed view there. My gut says virtue theory seems right. That wait, we're the sort of people that want to genetically engineer animals rather than making things better for them. I don't know. That just seems weird to me, but I don't have a sort of commitment there. But that's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh, Joel, I want to turn in the last few minutes to a couple of, I'm going to broadly call them moral theory questions, but the first comes from Michael Buchanan. He asks, if euthanasia is being used as a placeholder term for morally justified killings, what are good candidates for better and morally acceptable terms? Could the term sacrificing still be used if killing is deemed necessary because it connotes some sort of like important service provided to humans and other species? Or given the term's history, is the term sacrificing necessarily in bad faith?
Okay. Well, the whole like the overall thesis was that not, I mean, sort of an implication of the overall thesis is that not all morally justified killing is euthanasia. So, like, for purposes of argument, suppose that capital punishment is morally justified. That's a morally justified killing. also not euthanasia. I could go on, but the relevant point is that it's once again not just humane method, humane reason also matters. Was that too short of an answer? But I think that's sort of the gist of it. Yeah. And
No,
then we could talk about, so I think it would be helpful to have maybe more terms, because I think that's what's happening, right? We talk about morally justified killing, euthanasia is morally justified killing, so they're the same thing, but they're not. I'd say that euthanasia is a subcategory of morally justified killing. Actually, I'd even go further. I probably should have included this in the talk. I don't think that because an act is euthanasia, it's therefore justified. They're very obviously uh, on improper acts that are euthanasia. So you might judge that, for example, it's someone's better off dead and they're really suffering and you kill them against their will. So involuntary euthanasia, that's still euthanasia. It's just wrong. So I don't think there's any necessary connection. There's no identification between morally justified killing and euthanasia, nor is euthanasia as such always justified.
and it's the case too that it sounds like from your perspective, like terms like sacrificing have the same problem to them, that not in every case.
Oh, well, I don't know. Yeah. Sacrificing is maybe more honest than euthanasia for these cases. I haven't really thought much about what sacrificing means. To me, it has like strongly like religious vibes, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Like who are we sacrificing them for? Like what God are we on are they on the altar for? But maybe I'm just wrong about that, and I have the wrong sort of connotation in mind. Um, but yeah, if we're talking about sacrifice, I'm not sure we can call it both sacrifice and euthanasia, but that does fit the model of the war and service animals that are put up quite a bit of sacrifice, like all the horses that were honored after World War I and World War II. You could call that a sacrifice.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Well, big picture, you got me thinking about as you were talking through the distinction between humane reasons and humane methods, you got me thinking on the reason side. What happens when the assumer is wrong, right? So what happens if like the assumption's made that somebody's life is bad or would be bad in the future in one of your examples? What if the epistemic constraints around that decision are flawed? That is, the assumer is wrong. That seems like then the humane reason is contingent on some sort of like epistemic net that we all fall under and assume. So
Yeah, well, I
how
think
do
my
we
answer
get
to
to
the
humane?
previous question kind of suggests the answer here is that I think we can make a like someone can believe that they're doing what's in the best interest of someone and be mistaken about that belief.
Mhm.
So I think what would be required for euthanasia to move from just descriptively euthanasia to a morally justified euthanasia is something like the veracity of the claims to the best of our knowledge in light of current evidence and something like that. So yeah. And I think one of the points that the main paper that the Pavlosi paper I talked about, they're very worried about calling these acts euthanasia. So I think there might be something there about like labeling this, given how calling it euthanasia might be it might lead people to think that it's justified, that maybe we need to be even more careful than that in how we talk about it. But yeah, I don't want to assume that just because someone thinks they're doing what's in the animal's best interest that they therefore are. And especially when it comes to nonverbal people and human beings and then non-human animals, there's a knowledge gap. We don't fully know what's on their mind, and we're
Mhm.
prone to make mistakes. There's the sort of the solipsism problem as applied to animals, the other mind body problem. Yeah. So yeah, that's my thought with respect to that.
I feel like I'm still struggling as a philosopher working in ethics about the relationship between our knowledge claims and our ethical claims. And there's some sort of contingency built in, especially in your definition, that there needs to be, I mean, we could just lean on like a justified true belief model of knowledge. You
Mhm.
need to have the right view in order to have morally justified euthanasia. Because you could still have euthanasia that's not morally justified if your epistemic constraint is wrong. So
Right,
there's
right.
like a weird necessity that you need to know what you're doing. You need true knowledge before you can have morally justified action.
Seems right. Yeah.
Uh,
And I think part of that might, I kind of at the end emphasize the importance of role differences and maybe even role segregation that you're training. Like some people are going to be very apt to understand animal welfare concerns. That's not necessarily the same as being a good animal researcher. There's some overlap, but not entirely. So I think having people that are really cued in on what animal welfare is, and if you look to the AVMA guide, the conceptual parts about euthanasia is really short. Most of it is all the empirical stuff, like how do you actually humanely kill someone and what's the evidence behind different things. It's actually extraordinarily complicated, varies by species. There's all sorts of concerns that I think matter a lot. And all that's really contextual. And I'm not an expert on the particulars there, but that's a good question too. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. Yeah. Maybe we'll end with one that might be beyond the scope of our expertise here, but Yadlis, you have a question in the chat here. Do you want to ask that question or do you want me to read it? What would you prefer?
It's okay if you read it. I'm more of wondering rather than having a clear-cut question because I'm also not an expert in AI, but I am familiar with some of the capacity that generative systems have. And so deviations are probable, right? Not just possible, but probable within what the framework is. So I'm wondering how this would play into something as consequential as euthanasia.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so it seems like really important to get the code base right first so that the inferences are good. And there's always going to be sort of between cases that aren't covered. Um, yeah, I don't have much fancy to say about that. I think human oversight would matter a lot. I guess the motivating thing was this would probably reduce the number, if it's done right, reduce the number, reduce the amount of psychological load on human beings, and maybe also, if done well, reduce the kinds of errors that I think David Goldstein was worried about of humans just botching the procedures. It might be better implemented because AI is already a lot better than us in like diagnostic medical imaging and things like that. So maybe it'd be better in carrying out the procedures. That actually maybe has to do more with the intersection of AI with robotics that freaks me out, but is starting to happen because it's about the physical delivery, both the judgment, which is the AI part, and then the implementation. I think the combination of AI and robotics is something to think about. Again, I don't have a developed view there, not defending an idea, but it seems something worth thinking about at least a little bit. Also,
Yeah,
good question. Thanks.
yeah. She says it also freaks her out. Yeah. Yes, I think that's a really important angle. And I can readily imagine a world in which like slaughterhouse procedures and animal euthanasia and research are all sort of facilitated by some sort of AI integrated robotic system, which yes, we should all be paying attention to.
Yeah, is it Michael Pollan? He has that piece in Animal's Place, and he says if slaughterhouse walls were glass, they disappear overnight because we'd see what's going on in there. If there aren't even people inside anymore, that seems especially worrisome. That who's running the show?
Yeah, that's great. Dr. MacClellan, this has been eye-opening and if not a little depressing, but so important. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn things back over to Dr. Kubler.
Well, thank you, Dr. MacClellan, for joining us today and helping us understand more about this complex ethical landscape associated with using animals in research. And as always, I'd like to thank Dr. Beaver for moderating our discussion, and thank you, participants, for really great questions and engagements. Recording of this presentation is going to be made available, like all prior presentations, on the UCF Center for Ethics website, so you can view it again, and I hope you'll encourage others to have a look. It was really interesting, and they may enjoy some of the back programs. I will note that we talked a little bit about the ethics of creating different species, and that's kind of where we started this series maybe 3 years ago now. I'm not sure, with our very first ethically speaking seminar. So go back and take a look at that one on creating new life and xenobots. We've maybe come full circle. But you'll be able to find that past talk and many others along with information on upcoming ethically speaking events. So let me share my screen and tell you about the next one. AI is popping up everywhere, and so are ethical concerns. And they are far-reaching and include data protection, AI training, informed consent, disclosure of algorithmic structures, potential bias, and social justice issues of access and environmental impact, to name only a few. Too often, I think those discussions of AI ethics are dominated by purveyors of the technology rather than end users like you, or people with real expertise in ethics, normative theory, and understanding of how technology impacts society. Well, we hope to redress this situation a little bit with our next Ethically Speaking event, which is going to be, I think, special because it'll be an audience-driven panel discussion of ethics in AI. So our panel is going to include our very own Dr. Jonathan Beaver, along with UCF philosophy professor Mason Cash, and also some representation from the up-and-coming generation in thinking about AI ethics. That includes Carol Stinnett and April Beer, who are both UCF students studying ethics of AI. And we need you to join for what I hope will be a very vibrant discussion of the comparatively unexplored landscape of AI ethics. So please visit the UCF Center for Ethics website to register. And of course, I'll be sending out email with notifications about that. So please check your inbox. Ethically Speaking is made possible with support from the National Science Foundation and the many UCF partners you see listed here. I'd like to thank them for helping bring this series to you. And once again, thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you at our next presentation, Ethically Speaking.